Okay, right, so I have introduced myself and I'll just go through what we're hoping to kind of cover this afternoon. If I can have the next slide, please. Before I kind of launch into that, I'd forgotten I put this at the start. We will be going into the kind of technicalities of what the Pupil Premium Plus funding is for, what it's not for, and some of the kind of technical aspects of how it's distributed and so forth. But one of the kind of important things is to remember what we're trying to do. And I like this quote from Stephen Hawking here. It says, remember to look up the stars and not down at your feet. Try to make sense of what you see and wonder about what makes the universe exist. Be curious, and however difficult life may seem, there's always something you can do and succeed at. It matters that you don't just give up. And I think when we're talking about how to use funding, this particular pot of funding to support our looked after children and their learning and their success, we are kind of mindful of that ambition to really kind of engage those children and young people in their learning and try to remove some of the barriers and limits. So that's kind of in the back of the mind whilst talking about probably some of the slightly more mundane technical kind of stuff, but that's where I'd like to start. Okay, next slide, please. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is last December and January of this year, I carried out quite a big survey and review of our Pupil Premium Plus, how we're using it, what the money's for, what our policy is looking like, and how we want to use it going forward so it makes absolutely maximum impact. So I'm going to share some of the findings of that review, and a key part of that was a survey with designated teachers. So I've got the views of schools and quite a few other stakeholders as part of that. I want to explain some of the changes that I'm going to make, or we're going to make, to the Pupil Premium Plus policy, which will come into effect in September, and the implications for our practice and how we get the most out of that pot of money. Also answer any questions you've got, and as I've said, please feel free to put your hand up if you want to kind of ask directly, or put the questions in the chat and one of the virtual school team will alert me, because I'm not terribly good at multitasking, so we'll do it that way. So just before I move on, is there anything else that people are expecting to hear from this afternoon that hasn't been covered in those kind of bullet points above? Okay, we'll move on. So hopefully that's what you're expecting to hear. Right, okay. So the review, first of all, that I did, I just want to share a little bit about that for you. So what we need to do in every virtual school is to review the arrangements we have every year. That's a requirement within the statutory guidance and the conditions of grant, and it's good practice because things do change, and we've just had a very kind of extraordinary year, so obviously things are a little bit different, and we may need to adapt the way that we use Pupil Premium accordingly. So that's good practice. The second reason for doing a review was that we had in 2018 an Ofsted of Children's Services called an ILACS, and that came up with some findings around our use of Pupil Premium Plus in Surrey. And what they were saying, the local authority should closely analyse the impact of Pupil Premium in improving children's educational progress. So that is what we have set out to do with this review, and to put some of those things right that the inspectors felt at that point in time, given it was a little bit of a long time ago now, weren't quite right with Pupil Premium. So as I said, in the review, I've got the views of DTs, designated teachers, and quite a lot of people responded, which was really, really helpful. I've got the views of children and young people through our care councils, and I can share what they felt was important within that. we did, or I did, an analysis of the funding that was allocated to schools through the PEPs and how that was used. I got some lovely feedback around the impact it's making and how it's being used. And finally, an analysis of the part of the pupil premium that we retain centrally in the virtual school for a range of kind of interventions. So that all went into the mix for this particular review. Thank you. Can you got the next slide, please? Right, there's a bit of a talky bits coming up, so you'll have to bear with me for a few slides, but hopefully it'll all kind of make sense in terms of the context. So in doing the review, what we also looked at was what current research is saying about Pupil Premium Plus. How does it make maximum impact? What is saying about best practice? And to do that, I looked at certain key sources of information, notably the conditions of grant that DfE sets out and publishes every year. So that sets out how the grant should be used, Pupil Premium Plus grant. The statutory guidance for local authorities and what that's saying. The National Association of Virtual School Heads, of which we are part, and that is an organisation that has at its heart, you know, improving outcomes for children, young people in care experienced young people, and a kind of research arm as well. Also Ofsted and the Education Endowment Fund. So quite a few different kind of areas looked at, and a kind of a broad summary of what those sources are saying is that virtual schools have got quite a bit of flexibility in terms of how the grant is used and how it's administered. And if you have children from many different authorities in your school, you'll know that it's probably a source of great frustration as well, in terms of each virtual school does things a little bit differently. What I would say about that is that we are well networked into the South East group. And so I am in regular contact with my colleagues across the South East region and across the country as well, actually. And we do talk about those things. So if there's anything like that that's causing an issue, then do let me know. The second kind of key point of the summary really is that this particular funding shouldn't replace the support a school has already funded to provide. So it wouldn't be appropriate for it to entirely fund alternative provision in its entirety, though sometimes it's used to make a contribution towards that where that's appropriate, or it wouldn't replace what a school might have in terms of an EHCP funded provision for a child. And I will come on to that a little bit more in due course. And it's not a surprise to find that, you know, in all the research, we're talking about an evidence-based approach, and hence me looking at some of the research and what it's saying. And the key point as well around the research is that more is needed. So whilst we do have kind of research and studies of Pupil Premium in the broader sense, there's very little actually around Pupil Premium Plus and the impacts of different interventions for looked after children. And there's a little bit there from the EEF. They acknowledge, the Education Endowment Fund do acknowledge that not enough is known and more research is needed, and that some of the kind of interventions that are shown to have a positive impact on other groups of children may have different impacts for care experienced children. So that's kind of a whole new kind of thrust of national research. Okay, so can we have the next slide, please? Right, one kind of area of research, I won't dwell too much on it, but just to draw your attention to, I said there's not much. There is a really current piece of research that was commissioned by our National Association and through Bath Spa University. And these are some of the findings that came out of that study. As I've already mentioned, more research and work needed. Better access needed for designated teachers to training, advice and guidance and effective use. There's the kind of guidance in terms of, you know, this is what it's for, but not very much, not so much or not enough about good practice and what that looks like and some real examples. Also that the research focuses on academic impact, and there's not enough about the other impacts, like, for example, on emotional health and well-being and those kind of things. So the key areas for further study at the moment that were highlighted from that is using pupil premium for additionality, and also looking at the ways that our looked after children experience those interventions, looking at the needs of post-16 young people within that. There's not much information about that. And what impacts are we really looking at? And finally, and importantly, that the views of looked after children should be one of the most important things when considering how pupil premium is allocated and looking at the impact. And yet that's probably a little bit of a missing bit from a lot of the stuff that's written about Pupil Premium Plus. So I've tried to kind of weave all those elements into the new Pupil Premium policy that we're going to launch in September, and have been considered in the review as well. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Right, so what were DT's designated teachers in schools saying about Pupil Premium and the ways that we use it, administer it, distribute it, how it's accessed so far in the kind of current kind of existing policy? So I won't go through it all, but you know, there's broad kind of agreement and feeling that we've got the balance about right in terms of the current system, whereby designated teachers will request Pupil Premium Plus via their child's PEP or the children's PEP in their schools. And I think that's probably no different to most virtual schools and the way that they operate. It is possible to access Pupil Premium Plus 3 times a year through the PEP, so it's kind of available for request once a term. And but one of the interesting things was that there's a proportion of schools, which is probably a little bit higher than we would like, who don't request Pupil Premium Plus from the virtual school. And the review that I did kind of identifies some of the reasons for that. So things like the school may feel that the child's needs are already being met and no extra funding is needed, or that the child isn't eligible under the current policy, the current virtual school Pupil Premium policy, to receive Pupil Premium, or the system to access the money is not very straightforward to use. I think one of the key things and the key changes that I will kind of share that has come as a result of the review is that we will be changing the bit of the policy which says that children with EHCPs are currently not eligible for Pupil Premium Plus. And it was the whole kind of you know, issue around double funding. However, there's such strength of feeling about this issue, and the points that designated teachers made were extremely valid and compelling and evidence-based, and therefore we will be changing that for September. So that is you know, I hope you'll find that that's reassuring. The other kind of key areas that came out of the DT review was that we need to have a bit more of a focus on therapeutic interventions and those kind of interventions that support children's emotional and mental health needs, given that they cause a barrier or can cause a barrier to their educational achievement and outcomes. And at the end of the day, that's what Pupil Premium Plus is there to do, like all of the kinds of Pupil Premium. It's to close that attainment gap. But we know that for many of our children, their emotional health needs may cause a kind of barrier to progress and outcomes. So, you know, that's kind of been fed back from DTs. There's a little bit around in the survey around new designated teachers and wanting a bit more clarity from us around how to access the funding, what it can be used for. And so hopefully you will find that the new policy, it's got a whole section on good practice, some examples and frequently asked questions, which makes things a lot clearer. OK, so could I have the next slide, please? So children, young people. I went to meet with 3 different care council groups. So they are the some of the children, young people in the council who meet with a whole variety of people to share their views and their opinions about lots of different aspects of policies, practice that affect their day-to-day lives, health, accommodation, but one of the things will be education. So there are 3 different groups that meet. One is care leavers, which is our older young people. One is Care Council Juniors, which is our very youngest children who are care experienced, and the kind of the middle children and care group as well. So there's 3 different groups I went to speak to, and these are some of the things that they shared in terms of what they felt was important with their education. So they valued things like the transition resources when they were moving from year 6 to 7. There was one young person who said to me that she still has the calculator that, and she's kind of in her late teens now, she still has the calculator that was provided to her on a kind of transition between year 6 and year 7 by the virtual school. That was in that case. But I know that many schools, you know, support children's transition in lots of different ways, but that is really valued. The other things mentioned were the role of after-school clubs and trips, which young people massively valued. So things relating to music, sports, or to develop love of a particular curriculum subject. And the young people I spoke to really felt that helped to extend their learning, but had all kinds of other benefits as well in terms of making friends, access to a wider peer group, indulging their passion for a particular subject, and that being seen to support learning and contributing to that enjoyment of school, wanting to come to school and valuing them as individuals. So that was really interesting. And I think possibly in the past, our virtual school approach has been possibly a little bit narrow towards those kind of activities, and being careful they don't duplicate what you know, parents, carers would normally pay for, etc. But I think, you know, it's worth thinking about that in a broader sense, and that's reflected in the policy as well. One-to-one tutors, all the young people I spoke to thought, you know, felt really strongly that that was something that they felt was very much valued. And then the final point there, some of our care leavers reflected that there should have been more preparation for moving on and being independent whilst they were at school, reflecting that some of the demands of being independent for a fairly young age, for example, with financial awareness, budgeting, cooking processes, and so forth. You know, it was quite a lot to deal with once they were care leavers and moving into their adult lives. And reflecting that for many care experienced young people, that comes at a younger age than children who are with their birth families. So that is a kind of an interesting reflection. We've tried to think about that carefully in the policy. OK. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, it's come, sorry. Sorry, let me just take a sip of water there. Right, so just a couple more things in terms of the review. So the funding allocated to schools via the PEP. We looked at the range of ways that schools were spending the funding and the impact it was making. And it won't surprise you to know that a very wide range of interventions are being used because the cohort is very wide ranging and they have very individual needs. One of the things I mentioned earlier was that we felt, what the review did show was that schools, not as many schools are requesting Pupil Premium Plus as we would like, and we're keen to understand the reasons. Some of those reasons I've kind of mentioned already, which came through the survey. But we are going to be doing a few things to try and make it easier and try and encourage schools to kind of consider whether pupil premium is needed on a kind of term-by-term basis. One of the reasons that I've mentioned already is children with EHCPs under the current policy not being eligible for funding. We are going to be changing that. Another reason, though, was some schools feeling or believing that children in reception year, so year R in school, were not eligible. And so what we're going to be doing for that is, or what we arranged for September, is that year R will be included in the statutory school PEP rather than in the early years PEP, because I think that's been the cause of a little bit of confusion, and then they'll be able to request Pupil Premium in the usual way, but they are eligible for that funding, so that's the thing to say. The other thing that came through the DT part of the review is the very, very varied ways that one-to-one tuition is being used. It's not simply in terms of academic progress, although that is very, very important. But it has all kinds of other benefits, such as mentoring, support with self-regulation, support to extend the curriculum offer in some cases, all kinds of other benefits as well. So what I'm really keen to do is in the autumn term, just to look into a one-to-one tutoring in a little more detail, and just to pull out some of those really, really great kind of areas of practice, because I think there's some really innovative stuff being done there. And it's not just a case of academic progress, even though that is really, really really, really important rather. Okay, and then finally, there were some lovely examples as well of different kinds of therapeutic interventions being used to support children's social and emotional health, and especially so when children were transitioning at the end of a key stage or end of a school year. So lots of different kind of therapeutic interventions, play, music, art, writing, animal therapies, and a range of interventions via school ELSAs, and some training and resources being accessed via Pupil Premium Plus as well. So that is what the funding, what DTs were telling us about the way the funding is used. And I've captured some of those examples, specific examples, into the policy as well, which you'll see in September. Okay. And hopefully the final bit of this, the next slide, is the central part of Pupil Premium. So along with, I think, probably the vast majority, if not all, other virtual schools throughout the country, we do retain a small percentage of Pupil Premium Plus to fund central interventions, and they do vary from year to year. Just really depends on the needs of the cohort, the kind of wider circumstances. I mean, this past year has been an incredible year, and we've had to do things a little bit differently to support children in schools through the whole pandemic experience. So that will be an example of how, there's a different kind of prioritization and focus for the spend every year. So on that slide, it does give you the kind of the technical details about the funding. So what schools have available to them is £1,800 of funding per year, and it's split into, being able to apply for up to £600 each term through the PEP. That's not to say if there's something exceptional that's needed that you can't come and kind of approach the virtual school myself, just to kind of make that known, and we'll do that on a case-by-case basis. And through the year, the last year, what we found is there have been tremendous areas of progress for our children looked after through and the kind of the interventions that have been put in place through the centrally funded pupil premium have made a massive contribution to that. So there's a lot of things there. I won't go through all of them, but you know, the standards of personal education plans, the timeliness, the completion have massively improved term on term, and we do share those kind of that information in the newsletter that we send to DTs each term. Children missing education as well is massively reduced. We consistently now have below 2% of our children looked after. Our cohort, our statutory school age cohort, which is around the 650 mark. That's how many children we have in many different schools, many different settings, not only in Surrey, but in other local authorities as well. And a small minority of those are kind of without a school place, and we've worked really hard to kind of keep that to an absolute minimum. So some of the work around extra tutoring, alternative provision, therapeutic interventions that we put in, our service level agreements with different providers, they've made a contribution to bringing that percentage down. There's other things that like supporting children with adult relationships and self-regulation in terms of those kind of mentoring programs that we've been able to put in, improvement in literacy. Our Key Stage 4 results last year, we didn't publish them, but we certainly did collect them, and they showed a considerable improvement since the previous year, albeit it's a bit apples and pears and kind of comparing different things because the conditions were so different. So there's lots of ways that great improvements and stride forwards have been made, which is really great. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Right, so I know that I have talked a lot there, so are there any particular questions, queries, comments, or anything anybody would like to ask or say at this point? Please don't be shy, or put them in the chat if you would prefer, and we'll be happy to kind of answer any questions you have. Do we have any in the chat?
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So I've got an echo, I can hear myself twice.
Don't worry.
If we only claimed, say, £300 for a child in one term, because that's all they needed at that time, but the following term we felt they needed a lot more, maybe circumstances had changed, can we roll over the money from one term to another so it still doesn't go over the 1,800 in the year?
Yeah, so I think on the I'm right in saying that on the PEP there is a kind of a calculator facility, and it does kind of tot up as you go along. So the short answer is yes, in theory that is entirely possible, and you can make that known in on the PEP and when kind of talking to the educational support officer who looks at those PEPs. The only difficulty we have is that pupil premium runs from financial year to financial year, so it's kind of, so you can't kind of roll over once you get to March, because that money is then gone. But I mean, we don't waste it. If there's any remaining, then it's reallocated on anything that's needed for children and young people. But yes, in theory that is entirely possible, yes. And I do understand that, you know, some terms you might need a small amount, whereas another term you might need quite a lot more. I mean, a good thing would be to kind of look at the year to come and see if you can do a bit of planning around what do we think is going to be needed, and do that really kind of good assessment of needs at the start of the year. I hope that answers your question, Alison.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
There's a few in the chat now.
Okay, thank you.
That.
Right, let me just pull up the chat. Thank you. As I said, absolutely rubbish at multitasking, so I'm going to find them now. 2 seconds.
Please let me know if you want me to read anything out
Oh,
to you.
if you wouldn't mind, Lindy, that would really help, because I'll probably just forget not see one, which we would not want.
No problem. So Jin says, does DT need to fill in an extra PPP form to request pupil premium, or can this be requested on the EPEP?
So up to £600 per term can be requested on the EPEP. If you feel there is there's an exceptional circumstance whereby, you really need more than that, or there's a slightly different circumstance, then what you need to do really is to, there's no particular extra form or template to request that. But if you email the Education Support Officer, and feel free to copy in myself, that will be absolutely fine, because I know we're in a bit of we're in a position of being a transition stage with all of this. We've got a new policy with some new things coming into it, and there's bound to be questions and a bit of adjustment while we get used to the new policy and how it's going to work. So in this transition period, and which probably will last most of the year, then please feel free, if in doubt, to just email me with that information, or your Education Support Officer, usually link with. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Anwen. Now, Al Power, you've got your hand up, and I also see you have a question. Did you want to speak to the group? Do you feel comfortable?
Hi, thank you. Yes. I was just wondering about how to get a play therapist for a student starting in year 7. So maybe you answered that. Maybe you just do it as part of the EPEP, although my first meeting, I'm guessing, will probably be October. So it's something, having liaised with primary, I'd like to get in place for this student. Yeah.
So in terms of, do you mean accessing the funding to fund it, or do you mean finding one that's going to be somebody or a service that's going to be able to provide that for you?
Both.
Okay, that's fine. In terms of finding a reputable provider, because I'm sure the market is just full of people who may call themselves play therapists, so I would kind of recommend a thorough kind of check of any providers you use. My first port of call to do that would be your EP service. So just asking for a recommendation, or where they would kind of likely source that. I mean, it is possible that EPs may be able to provide that service themselves. So that would be my first port of call in terms of, I want to find a provider. Who do you know is out there? What should I look for, and that kind of thing. Or it may be that the primary school has already used somebody and can kind of recommend on that basis. So in terms of requesting that through the PEP, what we are doing is we're adding into the target section of the PEP a little bit more around needs analysis, because I think that was possibly missing, and it was difficult to then work out when schools were requesting a particular intervention, how it links with the child's needs. So, and part of the problem, I think, is that we didn't have that clearly. It wasn't in the PEP template. So we have asked Welfare Call to adjust our targets section to reflect that. And we will be providing a bit more kind of training and detail on that during the year. So what you would need to do is to identify that was a particular need, and in a short while we'll come on to look at some examples actually of that kind of thing, and reflect that into the target, and then make the request for that therapist, or that kind of that therapeutic approach in terms of an intervention in the PEP, and how much it will cost. So you will need to do a little bit of research. So it's probably a good time to be finding out what are the best providers, how much does it cost, ready to put that into the PEP. And I know that kind of looking at the targets around that, what's really hard, and I completely kind of understand this, is is creating a smart target with measurable outcomes that's based around children's social and emotional health. So that's a hard one. I have got some examples of that in the policy, because I recognise that's really can be quite challenging. But we're doing some work around that in terms of with that, because we also have an EP that's linked to our service, and that's funded through our central pupil premium. So we do have that resource. And so I will be kind of asking her for some further advice, guidance, training for ourselves and schools on that. So I hope that answers your question.
And like just lots of really helpful stuff, thank you. But just in terms of to get that early intervention, and the dates of the PEPs are quite set, aren't they, in terms of, you know, they're just before that October half term. So how can I go about, I don't want to be in a position of setting a target October half term and trying to get in a provider, and then we've missed that transition start.
You know, it's a valid point, and it's nothing I haven't thought of myself as well, actually. And I do have some good news about that, because we have recognised in the virtual school that this is a big deal, the point of transition, and that, you know, you want to kind of put things in early, and also to kind of support, you know, the money is coming. So what we are doing for the autumn term, and you'll find it in the policy, is rather than schools requesting and waiting till the timing of the PEP, what we'll be doing is issuing £600 to each school for each child. For that, we're making an automated payment. In other words, you will still have to show how it's being used and the impact it's made in the PEP, in the subsequent PEP. But to answer your specific question, because we recognise there's a kind of transition pressure and a need to get things in place, and it may be too late by the time, you know, you receive those children in their new schools or new year group in September, that is going to be there, and that will be issued during September. So £600 will be coming in September, so you can plan to use that and how you're going to use it now. Does that answer your question?
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, I'm glad I had a good answer for that one. So, so we'd thought about that.
This is really great. Now, Jin was next, and I can see Samantha also has her hand up. Jin says, my second question that is, if the young people after year 10, are they not entitled for PPP?
Right. Young people in year 11 are entitled to Pupil Premium Plus. So it stops after year 11. So once the young person has left year 11 school year, then there is no pupil premium that's attracted from the DFE for that young person. Right. There's a big caveat here, though. So in the virtual school, we do try as far as possible to support transition for those young people if there's an additional kind of need there, through some of the central funding that I mentioned earlier. The other thing is there's been some very heavy lobbying of the DFE by virtual schools throughout the country, and of the need for Pupil Premium Plus for young people post 16, so in years 12 and 13. And there are some signs that this this kind of message is getting through, and the word is that there will be some pilots developed around Pupil Premium Plus in the post 16 kind of arena, kind of through the next term or couple of terms. So we think that will possibly be, though you can't quote me on this, I know it's being recorded, but you can't quote me on this, this may be the precursor to the introduction of some kind of Pupil Premium Plus in the future for our post-16 learners. But it's been a subject of much debate with the DFE for some time. But your question was in relation to year 10. You can access Pupil Premium for year 11, though. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Enwyn. And last but not least, Samantha.
Hi there. Sorry if I just need to clear this up. So the automated payment of £600 will just be for, I'm at a secondary school, so it'll just be year 6 is coming into year 7.
No, it'll be for every child.
So every child will get an automated payment that we then, and we're going to use it automatically. We're not going to it's not an additional payment, we're automatically getting it.
No, it's not an additional payment. That will replace the need to request it, essentially.
Okay.
Because some of the feedback was around the timings that I think another colleague has made. The timings are sometimes difficult. So to help mitigate that, and also the fact that we felt that, not as many schools had requested pupil premium as we would expect for when I looked at it back in, that would have been the spring term. So bearing in mind we had the summer term as well, so I didn't include that in the kind of review I did. But, that was a little bit concerning. So I wanted to try and remove some of the barriers, whatever they may be, and make things a bit easier for schools to do their planning, especially at that transition point, by making that available. So you will get that funding, and as I said, it'll replace the request, the need to request it.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Linda has just said that, and I agree. Really useful questions. Thank you very much for those. Right, I'm glad I stopped for a few questions because there were quite a few. So thank you for those. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Right, so we may have preempted some of this information with a spoiler alert here. So we've preempted some of these questions, but let me just kind of walk you through some of the changes that we're going to make, which I've alluded to already. So for number one, you'll be able to request funding for children looked after who have EHCPs. The only exception to this is where children are placed in independent specialist settings. We would normally expect that all of their needs would be met through the funding provided by the LA to the school. And that's not an unusual Surrey Virtual School position. That's very consistent with, the vast majority of virtual schools. But always we'll look at a case-by-case basis, but that would be the kind of only exception. You would need to, this isn't a particular change, but would need to clarify how the funding will help to meet the identified needs which are not already funded from a different source. So if you're requesting Pupil Premium Plus for a child with an EHCP, you just need to confirm that what you're requesting is different from what you've already got kind of funded and provided through the EHCP. And we do recognise there are some differences, excuse me. So that is there. As I've mentioned, you can request funding for children looked after who are in Year R, including 4-year-olds, as long as they are in Year R. So we've kind of confirmed that into the policy and strengthened that position because it was causing a bit of confusion. And as I mentioned before, from September, you'll be able to use the statutory school age PEP for Year R rather than the early years one, which is, I think, where the confusion came from. Just mentioned this bit. So you'll receive £600 Pupil Premium Plus for the autumn term, which will not need to be requested, but the use and impact will still need to be evidenced in the spring PEP. And what you will begin to notice are some minor changes to the template. Tried not to make any major changes which are going to cause, a load of additional workload or anything like that for DTs in schools. I've mentioned already that we've added a column asking for something to describe the child's needs, to analyse the child's needs in the targets and outcomes section. And what you'll be able to do is be a lot more specific, like the colleague who mentioned about play therapy. You'll be able to explain these are the child's needs, and it'll be clear to see that the play therapy naturally follows on as a response to those identified needs. So that will help make everything a lot clearer, we think. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Right. What else does the policy say? I'm just seeing if there's anything I wanted to kind of particularly pull out from that slide. I've mentioned already, I think I can't make the point strongly enough though. So pupil premium spend needs to be clearly linked to children's identified needs and targets. So that's an absolute must. But I understand that, you know, I think you may be used to that if you've got children from other local authorities in your schools, where that's a bit more kind of prominent in the PEP template. It probably hasn't been in our template, so that will be changing, and I think that will help with all kinds of different issues. Right. Okay. Sorry, I'm just there's quite a lot on that slide. I think I've covered all of those points, so I don't want to repeat them. Okay. Yes. So can you go to the next slide, please? Right, so in terms of just bringing us back to what the pupil premium grant is for, it's there to close the attainment gap, the progress and attainment gap that exists for our care experienced children for a whole load of reasons. So we will expect to see in the targets a progress and attainment target. And just to say on a little bit of a further detail on the progress and attainment, there is a lot of space in the PEP to record children's data and their progress data. And just to reassure you that we absolutely use that information for all kinds of purposes, for planning where interventions should be targeted, for monitoring our cohort, which is one of our statutory duties. So it's really crucial that information is there. We do want to see a specific progress and attainment target for your child or young person. That's not to say that that's where the pupil premium might be targeted, because it might be one of these other areas it might be targeted, but it does need to be it does need to be in one of the targets. The other key areas, you know, to really consider in terms of target, and these will be very familiar to you, where you might want to think about how do we use pupil premium effectively and where do we support the child's needs, are some of these areas I've highlighted here on this slide, and they're really supporting the kind of, you know, there's the whole language about recovery and levelling up that's come out that are being used at the moment, and whatever kind of personal opinions you might have about that, there's no doubt that the pandemic has had a range of impacts on many children, not least our care experienced children. So as a result, you may want to then think about some of these other areas. We've talked about transition, and the example given before about play therapy and supporting that was a good example, I think. So transition and stabilisation, especially for those children who are new to care. And we've seen really, we've had a look at, we've done some kind of tracking actually recently of our children new to care, and we realised that that's such a period of turbulence for those, and change, huge change for those children, young people. So to stabilise and kind of help support transitions, so many different transitions, you may want to think about targets to support that particularly. So if a child is new to care, that may be where you want to kind of have a look and think, how can pupil premium support that need? Emotional health, we've also mentioned, well-being, resilience, especially I've put there for those with an elevated SDQ score. Now, SDQ scores may mean a lot or not very much to you at this stage. SDQ is Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire, and there is a place on the PEP to record that score. It is a kind of an assessment that's done for every child in care once they've been in care for a year. And it's an indicator really of emotional and mental health. So there's some scoring bandings, and on the basis of that, you have a kind of an indicator of a child's emotional and mental health. It's not the only thing that can be used, but it's something that is used, and we're going to be doing a lot more work over the next year to slightly demystify what SDQs are, and explain how they're used and how you can get information from them to support, to really support understanding that child, their needs, and also because they have that assessment on an annual basis, you can track changes in scores as well, which is really useful given it's so difficult to think how you measure progress in kind of emotional health needs. So it's a kind of difficult area to measure, but that is one way that we do have. You might be thinking about peer and adult relationships for that child and their needs in those areas. You might be thinking, just linking back to what the children and young people were saying about extracurricular clubs and so forth, you might be thinking about reconnecting with extracurricular activities, because we know they have so many benefits in terms of relational, emotional, cultural capital, and other benefits for the child and young person. Improving attendance, where the child has struggled with their attendance, and trying to kind of engage in their learning. So that might be an area. And then again, linking back to what we were saying about the comments from some of our care leavers about preparation for independence, thinking about that whole area, and how we might support that, particularly for those of our older children in secondary school. So in addition to progress and attainment, those are some of the areas you may want to build targets around, look at the needs of those children and people in those areas, and think how can Pupil Premium Plus support that. Other points on that slide there, we want you to consider, please consider how you might use Pupil Premium Plus at every PEP. So, it's not just a once a year thing. Think how it's going to support those children's targets each time that you have that PEP meeting, and how it will support there. And then there's spend and impact is evidenced. That's a kind of obviously a requirement. We're very accountable for Pupil Premium Plus. So we need to see that on each PEP. And I have to say there were some terrific examples given of how Pupil Premium was spent, and I've captured some of those examples in the policy. So it's more than just a dry policy, I assure you. It's got really good examples of how DTs have used the money, and and some of those ideas are really innovative and speak to some of the kind of issues that we've already talked about. And I've just put at the bottom there, there's sometimes a training and development need associated with all of that. And so we have a comprehensive training offer, and it's being developed now for the next year from the virtual schools, but it's a really, really key kind of area. So, sometimes considering Pupil Premium Plus in terms of funding training, if it's something very specific and it's not offered anywhere that you can see as part of, for example, the virtual schools offer, it might be something to consider. So I kind of leave you with that thought. Right, can we have the next slide, please? Right, well, we did do quite a kind of comprehensive round of questions there, but is there anything out of the kind of policy changes that I've outlined that anybody wants to ask at this stage? And Lindy, if you could do your feedback from the chat, that'd be great.
Oh, everyone's very quiet.
That's fine. That's absolutely fine. Okay, that's lovely. Okay, we'll crack on then, and we'll go to the next slide. This is the last leg of this afternoon session. I've given you some information there about good practice in relation to Pupil Premium Plus. This is an extract from the DfE statutory guidance for looked after children and previously looked after children. And it really encapsulates a lot of what we've talked about already. So I won't go through that now, but it is in there and it's a good reference point to come back to, I think. Can you have the next slide, please? Right, now I've mentioned a lot about identified needs, and I wanted to give some examples because it's easy to kind of talk about this, and when you think, I wanted to really kind of illustrate what I meant. All of this is in the policy, so you'll be able to have these examples, so don't worry about kind of trying to capture any of this stuff. So what I've got here are some examples of different children and young people. They are all fictitious, so if they bear any resemblance to anybody, or names or anything that people know, it's not those children. They're all fictitious examples, and they're a bit of a kind of a mixture from different sources, really. So the ones with a white background, they are the ones where particular needs have been identified. So this is on when you get to the PEP in September and you're looking at, well, what are the child's needs? These are the kinds of things that you could say, but there will be other things as well. The two children that have been highlighted there in the kind of pink colour, those aren't identified needs specifically, but they are they're examples of children where we know from feedback from DTs and schools, it's sometimes really difficult to think how you spend, what would you spend the pupil premium on? How would you support their needs? So we've added those. One is an example of a child who's absolutely flying academically, and sometimes you're thinking, well, what more can we provide? Their needs are met, they're doing well. What else can we consider? And the other one is a child whose needs are identified on the EHCP. So what might that look like in terms of additional needs? So we've got 8 different examples there. So if we can go to the next slide. Right, so there were the easiest kind of, well, for my mind anyway, the easiest area was looking at that purely academic target, because you can exactly pinpoint what the needs are, where the gap in the curriculum gap or the gap in learning is. The interventions are a bit more straightforward, and then you can see different impacts. So I've got an example there of a SMART target. So it's a very specific one around a child's academic needs. So that was the first example. Can we go to the next one, please? Slightly more tricky was when a child has a social emotional needs that you're trying to kind of firmly identify and then build a target around. So this was an example here for this particular child, Ryan, and this was about him feeling fearful about the virus and the impacts. And it's kind of manifesting itself in a kind of separation anxiety from carers. So what I've done there is to track across a kind of example of a SMART target, the kind of intervention, which in this case I believe was art therapy. So it was an example like the kind of the colleague mentioned before for play therapy, what that target may look like and what the impact was. And I have referenced there the STQ score as being one of the ways that you might measure that. Okay, so let's go to the next one. It'll be a whistle stop, I'm afraid, for these ones, but you will get the idea. Adult relationships, there's one focusing on that. And, we just know that our children, our care experienced children, they do struggle more with transitions. And during the pandemic, there was a kind of a different group of adults sometimes supporting that child, where the child was in a particular bubble during the lockdown periods, and the impact that it made. And then the support there, the intervention wanted was actually some additional hours for the school's ELSA. And also for that ELSA, some specific support from the school's EP to direct the programme of support that was being put in place and the impacts there. So you can have a look at that one. The next one, please. peer relationships. So a child who is struggling with making friendships and developing good peer relationships. The example there, I'll come back to the questions in a second. The example there is to part fund an alternative provision that supports that need, with an emphasis on how that will kind of support that child back in the education setting. I'll just give you the examples and I'll come back to questions in a second. Okay, the next one, please. This was an example around an unaccompanied asylum seeking child. It is relating in this case to the child's English language development needs, EAL needs, English as an additional language, and you can see that track through, but equally well, there may have been other needs relating to social, emotional and mental health as well. So important not to kind of overlook those. Right, next one, please. Transition, there's an example of a transition support with a child who's new to care and the support being put in place there. And again, that is focusing on ELSA supervision there. And the next one, please. Academically able student, and this focuses on really kind of extracurricular activities and ways to provide a wider experience, a wider curriculum experience for that young person and the benefits of that. So that will give you an example to kind of focus on that, a child who might have similar needs. And the last one, right, child with an EHCP. So that really explains, you know, when a child has got certain needs that are clearly identified and supported and funded through an EHCP, what the PEP targets look like for that child. I mean, hopefully they will feed into each other, given that the PEP is termly and the review for the EHCP will be annual, so we would hope there'll be some kind of streamlining between them. However, we do have children where there are different needs being presented to those identified in the EHCP, and it's just to kind of think about an example like that. Right, okay, can you move on to the next one then, please? Okay, so before we go to that slide, I think there were a few questions that I just want to pick up before we finish. Dee, would you be able to help me with the questions, please?
So Alison, she mentioned, are we allowed to suggest ELSA as PPP, as she's been told in the past that this should be part of the general school offer?
Right, okay, this is a really good question. So this is one of those examples that where we're slightly changing the kind of approach in the policy. It's not there yet. So there will be that transition stage, which I mentioned before, in terms of everybody getting used to it, and there will be some discussion around that. I think I mean, the point at the beginning stands in terms of, you know, if the ELSA is part of the kind of what's already funded in the school, then there wouldn't be a need to ask for additional funding for that ELSA through Pupil Premium Plus. However, in the examples I just gave, there was a need for additional hours, or there was a need for more support from the ELSA than would kind of normally be given to an individual child, or there was a need for the ELSA to have some training or some time with an EP to develop a really bespoke programme for that particular child. So that's where the funding was targeted. So it's a kind of a yes and no answer, I'm afraid, Alison, in terms of that. It really does come down to the individual child and the circumstances. And what I will be doing, because I've had these conversations with our education support officers, and we will be looking at examples together, and we all recognise there will be some changes and some things we need to discuss more. So I think if you have a kind of a situation where you think, well, you know, this is in line with the policy, it is above and beyond what we provide, then do get in contact with me, and then we'll sort that out on an individual basis. Does that answer your question, Alison?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else?
That was all there, and
Oh, I got 1 minute left.
Oh,
I'm not going to go through the last one, but the last bit of the policy that will be sent in September is frequently asked questions, and these are, I hope, the questions that we get asked the most in the virtual schools. So these are the kind of things. There's things about after school clubs, breakfast clubs, school uniform, funding laptops, you know, young children, extensive trips, occupational health or therapist assessment, transport, Elsa's there, Theraplay, funding a taekwondo after school club, that's an interesting one, funding a tutor. So the answers to all those questions, those are the kind of, those were some examples really, if we'd had a bit more time, to where you'd have to kind of have a discussion about the individual case, but the answers will be in the frequently asked questions. So I think what we may do is put on a few more of these kind of sessions through the term when we get into the kind of the detail of this and how it works in practice, because I do recognise it's going to be a bit of a transition year for us all. So I'm going to not go over time because I know you're extremely busy, and thank you so much for attending this afternoon. It's been great to hear your questions. It's given me a real kind of sense check about the kind of things that DTs and teachers and schools are particularly interested in and asking questions about. We will put another few sessions on next term and the term after, just to kind of carry on the conversation. But please do get in touch if you have any questions about this, or you know, you get into a bit of a conundrum about how the money should be spent. But at the end of the day, you know, we want our children to enjoy going to school, to achieve, to make progress, and to really enjoy their learning. So that's the kind of where we're going with all of this. Right, I will stop there. I'll hang around for a little bit longer in case anybody has some burning questions as individuals. But thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Virtual School team, for the support with the technicals. Apologies we didn't get the rooms quite sorted, but we'll work on that for the next time. So thank you very much.